Hi, I'm Derek, and today I'm talking about taking notes in TTRPGs. Overall, note-taking is a really good habit to have as a player, and you can certainly tell when a player isn't taking notes because their character is just incapable of recalling any proper nouns. They say things like, yes, we have to go to the city to talk to the wizard because our friend needs his help. They could be describing peoples and places in the campaign, or they could be bombing an audition for the Wizard of Oz. We will never know. And what a great campaign the Wizard of Oz would be. And not only does taking notes help you remember these pesky names, but it also helps you remember probably the most important thing about any RPG, which is...
Wait a minute! Who are you?
In life, we don't have to take notes about who we are, how we act, or what we want. Or, on paper, we shouldn't have to. In practice, maybe this is helpful sometimes. But in an RPG, taking notes about who your character is and what their motivations are is crucial to their entire fictional existence. Because otherwise, you're relying on your brain to remember everything clearly, and sometimes that is just not possible. Your character could look and act a certain way one session and completely different the next. But not with good notes. Notes are the key. In fact, your character sheet, the physical manifestation of your imaginary character, is just notes. Before I get into the nitty and gritty, I'd like to talk about what I would consider the biggest reason to take notes as a player. When things change nonsensically, when you've lost the plot, when you don't know your character, it can stifle immersion. Yes, immersion. The ability to vividly enter a fictional world, suspend your disbelief, and remove yourself from your feeble physical form. I would consider immersion to make up nearly half of the appeal of tabletop RPGs. It's certainly not everything these games have to offer. Some offer very little of it, in fact. But if your game is about telling a story, a level of immersion is necessary to do that. Immersion depends pretty heavily on your memory and understanding. The more you know about a world and how it works, the more easily you can suspend your disbelief and see the world before you. When pieces of the world are forgotten or misunderstood, the image of the world becomes more vague and illusory. It becomes harder to see what's in front of you. People often say that TTRPG players remember the events of their game like they were there. And if you've ever had a conversation with a nerd about their campaign, they often talk about what they did in DnD last session like they actually fought the dragon in person. These nerds were immersed in their campaign. And that's why they are excited to talk to you about every single convoluted detail, no matter how little sense it makes. And clearly it's enjoyable for them to tell you. Otherwise, why would they take the effort to do so? It is enjoyable to be immersed. All that is to say, a more accurate memory just means more immersion, and possibly more enjoyment. And yeah, there are plenty of other things that go into a game besides being immersive. And not all games need to be deeply immersive in the first place. Sometimes levity and ambivalence to the fiction is fun and even necessary. But if you want to channel that sweet, sweet immersion, you're going to first have to improve your memory. And notes are the best way to do that. And really, there is no one prescribed way to do it. The best way to take notes is the way that helps you remember what you need to remember. So I will show you how I do it and tell you what generally I take note of. Then you can figure out whatever works for you. First off, I try to separate my notes with a new document or page for each session. Within the session, I focus on a few things from my notes. Names. Names are the most common things you need to write down. During play, the silly fantasy gibberish that people, places, and things go by is the first thing that leaves every player's memory. With luck, your DM doesn't take their creation too seriously, and they recognize that Glowernock Scuffed Guts does not exist, and he isn't, and perhaps shouldn't, be thought about on more than one day each week. So when you can't spell the gibberish, either spell it how it's pronounced, or just ask and the GM may type it in the group chat or spell it out for you. Whatever works best for them. Really, they may just be happy that you're attempting in the first place. Anything to avoid playing the pronoun game. After names, I typically write a short description. My descriptions of people and places are pretty brief, maybe a few keywords like ogre, territorial, onion-like. Feel free to extend these descriptions into facts and information you learn about them. But don't skip playing the game while you're taking notes about it. You should still prioritize playing the game first. Another thing is to keep track of your party's activities. Just jot down when your party moves from one location to another and when they make choices or interact. This could be as simple as, we fought goblins, we headed west, By the end of the session, you should have a pretty succinct recap of what happened. Lastly, if you're like me and you have a listening comprehension of someone in a coma, you aren't going to be able to accurately note down everything. So, to cut the fat, just take notes about things your character experiences or learns about. This is easier or harder based on the aptitude of your character. Sometimes it means that you're taking very little notes at all, like when you're playing someone uninformed or altogether nonplussed. Other times it means that you're taking pages of notes when you're playing someone keen and inquisitive. But the point is that you know what your character knows. And as an end cap on every session's notes, you may want to write down a couple things your character wants to accomplish. Just a couple sentences like, go shopping, or ask the ranger about their feelings. And if your DM can see your notes, this is a really good thing for them too, because they can prepare for some things ahead of time. So they don't just have to pull a fully stocked magic shop out of their ass in the last minute. And this is just how I do it. My notes are fairly minimal. If you're a straight A student, feel free to take all of the notes about everything. Go nuts. The GM will either love it because you're invested in their campaign, or hate it because you remember everything and they can't get away with quietly retconning because you did notice and will mention it. Okay, now that you know how to take notes, let's talk about why you would want to in the first place. Taking notes is certainly helpful, but by the law of canceled plans, it is much easier not to do things than to do them. So, why take the harder option of taking notes? Is it worth it? First off, yes. Yes, it is. Note-taking is an incredible boon for players. We've already discussed immersion, but notes also allow you to uncover hidden aspects of the world, or see plot threads being woven. A lot of GMs shiver at the thought of their plot being outsmarted or worked around, but there is nothing more gratifying than being able to take control of a narrative with nothing but your actions and your notes. GMs often lay out neat bits of information throughout their campaigns, and if you're collecting them, you'll probably either stumble across something extraordinary or realize that it's all a sham and your GM is just making it up on the fly. Both interesting realizations. In particular, if you're in a campaign with an open world that your party can explore at their leisure, this is the perfect game to take notes. I could not recommend it more. Note-taking is twice as good in a non-linear game because you have more freedom to use any knowledge you acquire. In addition to all this, if you keep track of your character's knowledge and motivations in your notes, as I mentioned previously, you'll be able to jump in character quicker at the beginning of each session. After a week or more of worrying about your real life, it can be a little bit jarring to suddenly become another person. But these notes get rid of that initial lag and make more room for acting and action. Speaking of acting, by taking good notes, you can also speed up the game by creating more fluent interactions. If you're an actorly player, taking notes means that you won't have to stop roleplaying to ask the GM for clarification. And the GM won't need to pause your roleplay to correct any mistakes, and you will finally master those dreaded proper nouns. And I mean, basically, a lot of acting in RPGs is just improv. And just like actors have to memorize their scripts, it's always helpful for improvisers to memorize their character and the setting. Also, fun fact, GMs are not always perfect. And especially in more improvised campaigns, it may become very difficult for them to remember what random name they gave to that one bar you all trashed 10 sessions ago. If you take notes, you might be able to fill in the gaps for them. And really, the GM is already wearing a lot of hats. Should they also be responsible for recalling everything that happens in the game? But speaking of GMs, there are some GMs that may enforce note-taking a little too much. Tell me this, have you ever been playing and thought, wow, this is a fun game about creativity and self-expression and tactics. I sure would love to be tasked with studying every single concept of this fictional world that does not exist, and be expected to know everything that a person that lives there would know, even though this world is in fact fiction. And the GM may not even remember these details themselves. You probably haven't thought that. Because that's not fun unless you already take insane notes on your own. There should always be some level of information that you have access to without taking notes. There's a difference between what you know and what your character knows. Your character is bound to know things that you don't know just because they live in the setting, and you don't. And some of that knowledge is probably really useful. This is sort of like the opposite of metagaming, where your character informs your actions as a player, and not the other way around. And as an aside, I would also suggest that there should be information available to each character without requiring a check or a die roll. Yes, we love rolling, but it's just cool to know stuff because you're awesome. Overall, there should be an understanding between players and the GM of what players are expected to remember on their own. Note-taking is a great thing to ask about early on. If you're a player about to be in a campaign, it is a good idea to ask if you are expected to take notes before the campaign starts. This sort of dives into the realm of starting campaigns and running session zeros, and that's far too much for me to discuss in this video. But if you want me to cover that in more depth, or really anything else, you could visit my Patreon and pledge at the patron link tier, which lets you vote on future videos. Self-promotion aside, note-taking is a super helpful habit. If you can put the effort in to take notes, you should. Chances are it will improve your play. But if note-taking sounds like too much work or prevents you from focusing on the game in front of you, feel free not to. Hopefully, at your table, there is at least one player who takes good notes, or maybe you just have a really organized GM that can recall information for you. Like me. But it shouldn't be mandatory unless it's part of the game itself, like some games of Call of Cthulhu or other mystery games. And yeah, those are my thoughts on note-taking. Thank you to my generous patrons for supporting this channel and for suggesting this video in the first place. Little channel update, I've been posting my TikToks as shorts on this channel, so if the clock app isn't for you, but you want to watch my stuff, those are for you. Part 2 of making combat more fun and a video all about stealth are both coming soon, so stay tuned for that stuff.
So long.